What's up, guys? We're going to look at Chapter 2 of The Shadow over Innsmouth. Check out my video on the first one if you haven't. But I'm going to start with a true story, about something else. In 1987, in Goiânia, Brazil, a group of guys were scavenging through old buildings looking for scrap metal that they could sell to the junkyard. And on this day, they were in an old building, an old hospital, and they found this machine. They broke into this machine and saw what must have seemed like magic. It was a glowing core. And if your guess is that it was radiation, maybe the machine was some kind of scanner, you'd be right. And if your guess is that you don't want to touch that with your bare hands, you'd be right. But they did, and they pried it out and scraped off chunks and left dust all over the place. And one guy took it to the junkyard, and the junkyard guy took it to his home and showed it to his kid and his wife. And pretty soon, anyone who had been in contact with this started falling apart. Maybe their hands that had touched it were getting gangrenous, or maybe their breath that had got in the dust was starting to make them cough. And somebody called the government. I think it was the junkyard guy's wife, and they could pretty quickly figure out what happened. They said, hey guys, that stuff you took was cesium. It's a radioactive element, and it is absolutely not safe. And hundreds of people got sick from this, and a lot of people died or lost their hands or got cancer or got some pretty tough consequences, all because of that initial moment when they saw this glowing thing and decided, hey, we got to make that ours, okay? And the feeling, you got to think about the feeling they had, was probably not really greed. Maybe in general, when they're taking copper wire out of buildings to sell, you could describe that as greed. But the thing, when they see something so unexpected and so that you don't expect to meet like this glowing green artifact, is it magic? Is it alien? And the feeling they had at that moment, maybe curiosity is the right word, but it's definitely not something they usually felt, probably ever before or after. And that is what I think of ever since I heard that anecdote. I think of that when I read H.P. Lovecraft, because he writes stories about people who find things that they probably shouldn't, and find things that they probably can't control. It might be, in his version, it might be gods or monsters or crazy books with magic in them. But the idea is the same, is that you see this thing and you go, oh, I got to get in there. I got to figure it out. I got to, take what advantage I can. But maybe you can't, okay? We mentioned radiation, and that was in the 80s, but in the 20s and 30s when Lovecraft was active, radiation was a new thing, and it was amazing. You could see your skeleton with an x-ray, or you could cure cancer by putting the, radiation onto your liver or whatever. But people started getting sick, and the ones who were the smartest, the ones who were the most prepared, were the ones worst affected. Marie Curie won a couple Nobel Prizes, ended up dying from radiation exposure. So it was the kind of thing where, people, especially the smart academic people, were getting into trouble based on what they were finding real stuff that's really there, but it doesn't mean you're prepared for it. Keep that in mind, and I'll bring that back up as we go through. Shortly before 10 the next morning, I stood with one small valise in front of Hammond's drugstore on Old Market Square, waiting for the Innsmouth bus. As the hour for its arrival drew near, I noticed a general drift of the loungers to other places up the street, or to the ideal lunch across the square. Evidently, the ticket agent had not exaggerated the dislike which local people bore toward Innsmouth and its denizens. In a few moments, a small motor coach of extreme decrepitude and dirty gray color rattled down State Street, made a turn, and drew up at the curb beside me. I felt immediately that it was the right one, a guess which the half-illegible sign on the windshield, Arkham, Innsmouth, Newburyport, soon verified. There were only 3 passengers, dark, unkempt men of sullen visage and somewhat youthful cast, and when the vehicle stopped they clumsily shambled out and began walking up State Street in a silent, almost furtive fashion. The driver also alighted, and I watched him as he went into the drugstore to make some purchase. This, I reflected, must be the Joe Sargent mentioned by the ticket agent, and even before I noticed any details there spread over me a wave of spontaneous aversion, which could be neither checked nor explained. It suddenly struck me as very natural that the local people should not wish to ride on a bus owned and driven by this man, or to visit any oftener than possible the habitat of such a man and his kinsfolk. So we saw in Chapter 1 that the ticket agent told our guy, you probably don't want to go to Innsmouth. And he said people don't like them, and he said all kinds of things, but maybe it was just that guy. Now we have confirmation that the other townsfolk have a similar disposition. You ever do that experiment where you have like pepper in water and you drop a drop of soap and it just goes away from the soap? That's what the people do when the bus comes by. They just, move away without even really thinking about it. They just know it must be something bad. And our narrator feels it too. He sees this guy for a second, immediately says, I don't know, man. In Chapter 1, they use the word prejudice, and that's exactly what this is. He sees the driver, and he just knows, I don't know. Maybe he's wrong. Maybe Innsmouth people are fine. We don't have any actual evidence. We just have the feeling. But he gets it. He can't stop himself. When the driver came out of the store, I looked at him more carefully and tried to determine the source of my evil impression. He was a thin, stoop-shouldered man, not much under 6 feet tall, dressed in shabby blue civilian clothes and wearing a frayed gray golf cap. His age was perhaps 35, but the odd, deep creases in the sides of his neck made him seem older when one did not study his dull, expressionless face. He had a narrow head, bulging, watery blue eyes that seemed never to wink, a flat nose, a receding forehead and chin, and singularly undeveloped ears. His long, thick lip and coarse-poured grayish cheeks seemed almost beardless except some sparse yellow hairs that straggled and curled in irregular patches. And in places the surface seemed queerly irregular, as if peeling from some cutaneous disease. His hands were large and heavily veined, and he had a very unusual grayish-blue tinge. The fingers were strikingly short in proportion to the rest of his structure, and seemed to have a tendency to curl closely into the huge palm. As he walked toward the bus, I observed his peculiarly shambling gait and saw that his feet were inordinately immense. The more I studied them, the more I wondered how he could buy any shoes to fit them. Okay, this paragraph is extremely important, and we can look at it in many ways. One, it's a description of the guy. We finally see what's going on with the Innsmouth people. Two, it's foreshadowing. Okay, later when you see what's really going on and you look back at this, you'll go, oh, now I see what they were talking about. 3, it gets into the whole question of the narrator's point of view and Lovecraft's personality, good and bad, because they are completely shamelessly judging this guy based on his look, right? We don't hear him speak. We don't see his deeds or anything, but he's saying like, oh, this guy, maybe he has a disease. Pretty soon he's going to say maybe there's something going on with his ancestry. And we have a little bit of fighting against that, in Chapter 1. You're like, oh, maybe it's just prejudice. Maybe we should give him a chance. But mostly our narrator gives into it, and he thinks, yes, I can judge these people by their appearance. And sometimes that turns out to be wrong. Just like when the guys looked at the radioactive core in this machine in this hospital, their first impression turned out to be wrong. They thought it was going to be helpful and valuable and great. Not quite. And when this guy looks at the Innsmouth people, we see one in terms of the driver. Doesn't mean he's going to be right about his impression, but it means he has that impression, right? It's just so overpowering, or at least he doesn't try to fight it. Now, in real life, in the 20s and 30s, just like radiation was a new science and people were way off in terms of what they understood. I don't know if you've seen, like, people would sell, like, oh, you can buy little toys with radium and they glow and it's cool. And, you know, people were killing themselves with this stuff because they didn't understand. Similarly, there was a lot of science they didn't understand, and a lot of it, and instead of just looking silly when we glance back, looks just, evil or racist, because they had this thing called physiognomy where they would judge people by their characteristics, especially their head, and this brow makes him aggressive, or this head shape denotes intelligence. When we look back now, we can go, oh, well, that was just British people finding an excuse for why they could take over some island. But Lovecraft was totally into it, And so if you look at the next paragraph, we're going to see that. A certain greasiness about the fellow increased my dislike. He was evidently given to working or lounging around the fish stocks, and carried with him much of their characteristic smell. Okay, the guy smells like fish. It's not his fault. He works on the thing. If you work in the library, you smell like books. It's not better or worse. It's just the luck of what class and family you were born into. And maybe our narrator will figure that out and be less judgmental. But right now, he's just like totally giving in to these impulses, and it's not very nice. Just what foreign blood was in him, I could not even guess. In chapter 1, we saw, I don't know what I'm doing with my finger here, we saw that they mentioned Innsmouth was being judged by the people around, and one reason why, they said, well, maybe the reason why is because one of the guys married a foreigner. Maybe that's why we hate the town. Maybe it's that kind of prejudice. One of the guys married a foreigner, and so everyone turned against him. We don't know. That's all rumor at this point, but that's what they were talking about. And our narrator is thinking of it in that way. His oddities certainly did not look Asiatic, Polynesian, Levantine, or Negroid, yet I could see why the people found him alien. So this is, some of that race science of the time where they were trying to put people into categories, and our guy says, you know what? Joe Sargent, who drives the bus, does not fit into one of these categories. None of these have grayish blue skin, right? We have this word alien, which is a word we use now to talk about Martians, but at the time it was usually used for foreign, okay? I myself would have thought of biological degeneration rather than alienage. So this guy says, I don't think it's a racial thing. I think it's maybe disease, maybe a lack of sunlight is messing this guy up, maybe a lack of minerals or something. In this time, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of a guy named Weston Price, which is a great, like, Victorian-ish sciencey name. Weston Price was I think Canadian dentist who went around the world, and he would look at people's teeth, and if you read his book, it's so hilarious now because of the sort of judgmental nature of it. But what he found was that the people sticking with their traditional way of life and their traditional diet had wonderful teeth and strong and fit into their jaw, and they didn't need dentistry, and they were bright white for their whole lives. But the people who dealt with the white man and got their flour and sugar and coffee and all of this stuff, they were having tooth decay, and they needed a dentist to pull out one of their teeth because it didn't grow right and all of this stuff. We don't have that problem so much now, but it was this idea of, like, he used that word a lot, and that's why I thought of it, degeneration, this idea of, if you don't have the right conditions, if you don't have the right food or sunlight or exercise or anything, you're going to start falling apart. I was sorry when I saw that there would be no other passengers on the bus. Somehow I did not like the idea of riding alone with this driver. But as leaving time obviously approached, I conquered my qualms and followed the man aboard, extending him a $1 bill and murmuring the single word, Innsmouth. He looked curiously at me for a second as he returned 40 cents change without speaking. I took a seat far behind him, but on the same side of the bus, since I wished to watch the shore during the journey. The shore, we always mention that, and in this story we see it a lot. In horror, the ocean represents the unknown. Who knows what's in the deep? Maybe it's a shark, or maybe it's something we've never heard of, sea monsters and that kind of thing. Or maybe other people come in on a ship. Who knows what can be brought in. A lot of horror, a lot of American horror, is in this area. If you read Edgar Allan Poe, he's from Baltimore. A lot of the stuff is in there. If you read Stephen King, he's from Maine. A lot of the stuff is set in Maine. And if you read H.P. Lovecraft, he's from, I believe, Rhode Island, and this story is definitely mentioning Rhode Island. They have every reason. Obviously, they were born there and they were going with their environment. But there are every reason why that works for horror. One, you got to see who knows what's in there. Two, you've got the history of witches and witch trials and different people fighting over the land. This was owned by the Native Americans, and then the Dutch, and then the British, and then, there's all kinds of conflict and scary houses and everything in this area. So the next few paragraphs are going to mention that. Our narrator looks out the window, he sees what's going on, and he's going to get into Innsmouth. I'll let you guys read the rest, but he's going to get into Innsmouth, and he's going to see that it's kind of scary. His first impression might turn out to be wrong, but he knows something's up. He knows something is suspicious, at least, and he's going to hear about a couple more of the proper nouns that were mentioned in chapter 1. We heard about some of the people who started the town, or some of the people who started this cult called the Order of Dagon. We're going to get into that. And in general, this is a nice, slow, creeping story. When we read short stories in the first semester, or the first quarter, they had to get in and get out and do their thing. But this one is longer, and it can get into that. You just take one step in the haunted house, and you hear a creak, and you see a shape against the moon. And was it a demon hand, or was it just a tree branch? This one can get into that. The whole time, I want you to think of two things. There's the conflict between the magic superstition side of humans and the science rational side. Okay, this is another thing that we get from Edgar Allan Poe. The magic and superstition is sometimes good. Sometimes if you stay away from scary stuff, well, it saves you. But other times it leads you into dealing with things that either don't help, or they waste your time, or maybe, summon a creature you didn't want to. And the science rational side is also neither good nor bad. It depends. So in this story, our narrator tries to be scientific, and he sometimes learns things in the right way, with experimentation and looking for facts and resisting the urges of fear and so on. But it's also bad, because first of all, it leads him to this in the first place, and it makes his judgments very, very dependent on the science of the time, which again we see was based on class and race and all kinds of things that are not right. They're not, not only not morally right, but also just incorrect. If you take calipers on somebody's head and you say, oh, well, this cranial ridge is going to mean that you have an aptitude for whatever, you are going to be wrong. So the magic superstition side of humanity can help you or hurt you, and the science rational side of humanity can help or hurt you, at least in this universe. I'm not giving you life advice. Keep that in mind as we go, and remember, it's not too much about the narrator. We don't care about the narrator. If you don't like him, that's fine. It's about the world and the people who have been here before and who have made these discoveries, and what can we learn from them? Just like what can we learn from the guys in 1987 who cracked open a CAT scan or whatever and found the cesium. Don't judge them. Don't say, oh, they're stupid. Think about the human emotions they felt. See ya.